March 1895. In Tipperary, Ireland, a low mist clings to the fields. The cottages here are small and scattered. Small dots of light spread across a dark landscape. And somewhere beyond the village, a ring of ancient earth rises from the grass. What the Irish call a fairy fort, a place people don't dare walk after sunset. One of these cottages sits alone on a hillside above Ballyvadlia, its walls trembling in the wind as smoke curls out the chimney. Inside, a young woman lies in bed. Her name is Bridget Cleary. She's 26 years old, married, independent, sharp-witted. She keeps hens, sells eggs, and works as a dressmaker. She's proud of the Singer sewing machine by her window, a symbol of modernity in a countryside where people still talk about the good people and where the boundary between folklore and daily life has never been clean. But tonight, Bridget is sick. Her skin burns with fever. Her breathing is shallow. She drifts in and out of sleep while shadows move around her bed. She's been like this for more than a week already. Her husband Michael Cleary watches her closely. Her father Patrick Boland hovers nearby. Neighbours, cousins, and even a local storyteller crowd around the bed, whispering to each other in the flickering candlelight. A doctor has already visited. A priest has already given last rites. And yet, none of those things seem to matter now, because nobody's talking about helping her anymore, about medicine or cures. They're talking about fairies, about changelings, because more and more they're starting to think that the woman in the bed might not be Bridget at all. And in the days to come, that suspicion will only deepen. Michael will lean over her, again and again, demanding, "Are you Bridget Boland, the wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" She will manage to answer once, even twice when she's asked again. But the third time, she'll hesitate. And that hesitation, that one breath too long, will open the door to a belief older than the house, older than the village, older than any doctor or priest. A belief that says the real Bridget has been taken, and that the woman in the bed is a changeling, a fairy spirit in the shape of a wife. And over the next 48 hours, this small cottage will become the scene of one of Ireland's darkest crimes. A collision of folklore and fear. A case so shocking that newspapers will wrongly call Bridget the last witch burned in Ireland. There's an old Irish nursery rhyme that goes, "Are you a witch or are you a fairy? Or are you the wife of Michael Cleary?" This is the disturbing true story behind that almost playful rhyme. This is the story of Bridget Cleary and the Tipperary horror. Rural Ireland in the 1890s was a place caught between two worlds. On the one side, there was modern life, the railways that cut across the countryside, bringing mail and newspapers from big cities like Dublin, the telegraph wires stretching over fields, new inventions slipping quietly into rural homes, like Bridget's own prized Singer sewing machine. On the other side, there was the old world, a landscape shaped by ancient stories of banshees and spirits, a countryside dotted with ring forts, grassy mounds rising out of the fields, where for centuries it had been believed the good people lived, the fairies. And fairies in rural Ireland weren't winged little creatures from a storybook. They were powerful, unpredictable, and dangerous. People walked around certain hillsides. They refused to cut bushes that grew near the mounds. Everyone knew the stories. If a cow fell sick, if a child looked thinner and paler than usual, if someone began acting strangely, or simply didn't quite fit the mould, then there was a genuine belief that fairies had taken them and left a changeling behind. When Bridget was born on February 19, 1869 in Ballyvadlia, this was the world she entered. She was the only daughter of Patrick and Bridget Boland, ordinary farmers living ordinary rural lives. She was clever, lively, and fond of good clothes, and by the early 1880s, she was already building a life with more independence and freedom than many women of her age. As a teenager, she trained and worked in Clonmel, serving as a dressmaker's apprentice. And it was there that she met Michael Cleary, a cooper who she married in 1887. But the marriage didn't begin in the usual way. After the wedding, Bridget returned to Ballyvadlia to live with her parents, while Michael continued working in Clonmel. And while they lived apart, her independence only grew. She kept her own flock of hens, selling eggs to her neighbours and earning her own income. She dressed smartly, and eventually she purchased that Singer sewing machine, a state-of-the-art piece of technology that enabled her to make and sell dresses, and marked her out as someone just a little more forward than her neighbours. Even when they finally began living together, her marriage to Michael was uneasy. He was older, often away working in nearby towns, and came from a family marked by mental illness, with his mother having spent time in a psychiatric hospital. Bridget was young, attractive, and financially self-sufficient. She had her own clients, her own income, and she walked across the moors every day by herself. For some, that combination, modern, independent, and female, led to admiration. For others, it led to resentment, and it made her the subject of gossip and suspicion. Even within her own marriage, there was tension and insecurity running quietly beneath the surface. When he'd married her, Michael had expected a traditional Catholic marriage, with the husband working and the wife staying home to manage the household. Instead, he struggled to find steady work, and Bridget's work effectively became their main source of income. She was becoming more successful, more confident, and more independent by the day. And for Michael, this led to feelings of both jealousy and embarrassment. But still, they presented as a respectable couple. They had no children, which was seen as a little strange in the small community, but there were no real scandals or drama surrounding them. When Bridget's mother passed away, she and Michael took responsibility for her elderly father, Patrick. Because Patrick was a former labourer, under local housing laws he was entitled to apply for a labourer's cottage, and through him, the couple secured one of the best houses in the village. But their new home came with a shadow over it. Locals believed it had been built on the edge of an old fairy fort. So despite being one of the nicest houses available, no one else had wanted it. Bridget didn't seem to mind, but superstition in Ballyvadlia clung to everything. The belief in fairies and the supernatural wasn't metaphorical. It shaped real decisions in real homes when real fear took hold. That combination, Bridget's independence, Michael's insecurity, and a landscape steeped in folklore, created the conditions for what came next. And before March of 1895 was over, it would shape Bridget's fate. Bridget's final week began with a simple errand. On Monday, March 4th, she left home to deliver eggs, reportedly stopping for a while near the Kylenagrana Hill Fairy Fort. What she did there is unclear, but the weather was cold and damp, and when she returned, she had a raging pain in her head and said that she couldn't get warm. Over the next 2 days, her symptoms continued to get worse. Shivering, weakness, fever, a painful cough, difficulty breathing. Michael sent for the local doctor multiple times, but he was delayed. Bad roads, other patients, and a general shortage of physicians in rural Tipperary meant days passed before he arrived. Bridget's father, Patrick, even walked several miles in the rain several times to try and track him down to no avail. When Dr. Crean finally arrived on March 13th, he examined her and diagnosed her with nervous excitement and slight bronchitis. He gave her some medication and left. That same day, Father Ryan, the local priest, arrived to give Bridget communion and her last rites, just in case. He left believing Bridget was ill, but in no immediate danger. But he didn't see what was happening behind closed doors. Because in all that time the family had been waiting for the doctor to arrive, something had started to change. Neighbours came and went, the same people who were already suspicious of Bridget. And day by day, whispers began to spread between them that something wasn't quite right about her. And that's when Jack Dunn entered the story. Jack was a local storyteller, what's known as a changeling, a traditional Irish storyteller who served as a repository of oral history, legends, and lore. He knew every legend in the region. He knew which forts belonged to which fairy clans. He knew which illnesses were believed to signal fairy trouble. He was respected. People listened to him. And on that evening, when he visited Bridget's bedside, he took one look at her pale face, her trembling hands, her exhausted silence, and said the words that would change everything. "That is not your wife." He said that she looked too fine and too sharp-featured, that she'd grown 2 inches taller, that her manner was wrong. Bridget, he said, had been taken by the good people at the fort and replaced by a changeling. Jack said that the woman before them was a fairy replica, left behind while the real Bridget was being held beneath a fairy fort, or in some otherworldly place beyond human sight. In Irish folklore, the fairy double was thought to be sickly, strange, and subtly wrong, and the cure, if you believed in such things, was to force the changeling to reveal itself, often by pretty violent and brutal means. When Jack spoke, Michael listened, and something inside his exhausted head cracked. He'd always been uneasy about illnesses. His mother's mental decline had haunted him. And now, faced with a wife who seemed to slip further from him by the hour, Jack's words made a twisted kind of sense to him. They offered a story, a terrible one, but a story that gave Michael the illusion of control, the idea that something could be done to fix the situation. And Michael clung to it. So that evening, he went to consult a fairy doctor called Dennis Gainey and returned with a bitter herbal concoction meant to expel the fairy. And this was the moment when everything that followed became possible, because when a person believes their loved one is no longer human, there are very few lines they aren't willing to cross. The bottle of bitter herbs Michael brought back from the fairy doctor was mixed with milk, because fairies supposedly found milk irresistible. Then Bridget was propped upright in bed, trembling, half delirious, and barely able to lift her head. A crowd gathered around her. Alongside Michael and her father Patrick, there was the extended Kennedy family, her Aunt Mary, her sons Patrick, James and William, and her daughter Joanna Burke. There were multiple neighbours, and of course there was Jack the storyteller, who remained at the centre of everything. He leaned over Bridget with the authority of a man who believed he knew exactly what was wrong. He repeated scraps of fairy lore like instructions handed down through generations. Michael tried to pour the mixture between her lips. Bridget gagged, retched, tried desperately to turn her head away. But the three Kennedy cousins, big, strong men from Tipperary, held her arms, her legs, her shoulders, physically restraining her. Joanna also gripped her from one side as Jack murmured for them to keep her still. Someone splashed holy water across her chest. Her Aunt Mary and another cousin then appeared with a saucepan of foul-smelling liquid and hurled it over her body. It was urine, a filthy, humiliating cure meant to repel fairies. Jack kept urging them on. "Make a good fire," he told them, "and we will make her answer." Michael seized on that. He heated a poker in the flames until it glowed. Then he brought it so close to Bridget's mouth that she could feel the heat blistering against her skin. Some witnesses said he touched her with it, burning her. The men lifted her from the bed, swung her through the air like a trapped animal, and carried her toward the fireplace. They held her over the flames while Patrick, her own father, asked her to declare her name. Even he didn't believe she was the real Bridget. Between these cures, Bridget cried and screamed for help. She asked for mercy. She asked why they were doing this to her. She asked for her father. But no one was listening to her anymore. They were listening to the story they'd chosen to believe, the one Jack was telling them. The people who were supposed to love Bridget the most in the world were torturing her. When the frenzy finally died down and they laid her back onto the bed, Bridget had no fight left in her. That night, as the cottage fell quiet, something else happened. Something Jack seized on immediately. News arrived that Michael's father had just died. Some relatives left to attend the wake. Jack told Michael the timing wasn't coincidence. It was confirmation. The fairies were creating tragedy to distract them. They were trying to pull attention away from the changeling in the bed, and Michael believed every word. The next day, Bridget seemed better, or at least well enough that people convinced themselves she was recovering. To some, she looked cured of the bronchitis. To others, she looked cured of the fairies. On Friday the 15th, Bridget sat up, drank tea, and even dressed herself in her good clothes, the black church dress, the stylish cloak she prized almost as much as her sewing machine, the neat black stockings pulled to her knees. If you were standing in the cottage then, you might have believed the worst had passed. That evening the room filled again. But this time there was no Jack, no neighbours, no outsiders, just Michael, her father, and her extended family. And the group weren't crowding around her bed now. They were in the kitchen, watching, testing, waiting for any sign that the woman in front of them was still the Bridget they knew, or something else entirely. And then Bridget asked for milk in her tea. Of course, it was a perfectly normal request. Most people have milk in their tea. But for Michael, whose mind was now fully entangled in folklore, it was proof she was a fairy. Because fairies and changelings craved milk. Michael confronted her, shouting accusations at her. But this time, Bridget pushed back. Maybe it was frustration. Maybe fear. Maybe, after days of being humiliated and manhandled, it was the last scrap of dignity she had left. She told him he had fairies on the brain because his mother had been taken by them. Whether she meant it literally, or as an exhausted jab at his obsessions, it struck straight at an old wound. Her cousin Joanna stepped in with tea and bread to try and calm the room. Michael suddenly jumped up, grabbed a plate, and cut 3 pieces of bread and spread jam on them with a strange, ritualistic intensity. He then said Bridget had to eat the 3 pieces before she could drink her tea, another test from his paranoid brain. He held out the first piece and demanded, "Are you Bridget Boland, wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" She answered yes, so he fed her the second piece and asked again. And again, she answered yes. Weaker, more of a whisper, but still clear. Then came the third piece, the third question, the moment that mattered more than anything else that had happened yet, at least in Michael's mind. "Are you Bridget Boland, wife of Michael Cleary, in the name of God?" Bridget hesitated, just for a second. Maybe she didn't hear him properly. Maybe she was too exhausted. Maybe she simply couldn't force another humiliating answer past her lips. But that one pause, that single breath too long, was enough. Because in fairy lore, 3 is everything. 3 chances. 3 questions. 3 tests to force a fairy to reveal itself. And when she didn't answer the third time, Michael completely snapped. He forced the last piece of bread into her mouth, shoving it into her lips, choking her as he pressed his knee onto her chest. Bridget struggled, gagging, trying to push him away. He dragged her up from the chair and knocked her backwards across the room. She hit her head hard on the floor. He jumped on her, tearing at her clothes while she cried out, too weak and terrified to fight him off. He then dragged her half-naked body over to the open fireplace, grabbed a log from the fire, and began to pour lamp oil over her body. And through it all, everyone else just watched. Joanna stood off to one side, clutching her own young daughter, unable to move or speak. At least one cousin, Patrick Kennedy, would later claim he begged Michael not to burn her. But if he did, he didn't make any effort to stop him. None of them did. Before anyone knew what was happening, Michael thrust the flaming log against his wife's body. The flames caught almost instantly. The fire rose fast, filling the air with the stench of burning wool and human skin as Bridget screamed and screamed. Until, suddenly, she didn't. In that tiny cottage, framed by firelight, a young woman burned to death on the kitchen floor while the people closest to her, her husband, her father, her cousins, stood within arm's reach and did nothing. For a long moment, no one moved. Michael sat in a chair by the fireplace, staring at the charred remains of his wife as if he were watching a log burn down to ash. His face was expressionless, detached, almost calm. And then finally he spoke. Not to the others, not to the body, but to the room. "She's not my wife. She's an old deceiver sent in her place." The people around him, her family members, didn't know how to respond. Joanna sobbed as she clung to her young daughter. One of the cousins fainted. One of them tried the door, wanting to run, only to find it locked. Michael then told them that he had the only key, and that none of them were leaving until he got his real wife back. So they all watched as Michael dragged what remained of Bridget towards the back door. He lifted her onto an old sack, her body still warm and still smoking. Then, with the help of her cousin Patrick Kennedy, he carried her out into the darkness. According to Patrick's later account, he only helped out of fear he would be killed if he refused. Michael locked the door behind him, so the others were forced to wait in that smoke-choked cottage for him to return. He didn't take his wife's body to a churchyard, or even a hidden corner of a field. He took her to the fairy fort at Kylenagrana Hill, where he dug a shallow hole in a ditch, just deep enough to cover the body, but not deep enough to count as a burial. Then he tipped her into it and pushed soil over her. Because to Michael, this wasn't the body of his wife. This wasn't even a murder. It was a ritual. The final act in a battle with something that wasn't human. Michael and Patrick returned to the cottage and washed her remains off their hands and clothes. Michael then told them that Bridget would come riding out of the fairy fort on a white horse at midnight, bound with ropes, and if he was there to cut her free, he would be able to bring her back with him. So he grabbed a large kitchen knife, preparing to head out. But before leaving, he coached the group on what they should say if anybody asked about Bridget. The story was simple. She'd walked out of the door alive but delirious in her fever. She'd spat at Joanna on her way out, and none of them knew where she'd gone after that. Joanna was still sobbing hysterically. She hadn't participated in anything that happened, but she had seen everything. So Michael forced her to swear before God that she would never tell anyone what had happened, even if the body was found. Terrified, Joanna did what she was told, and only then did he hand over the key and allow her and the others to leave. None of them went to get help. None of them ran to get the priest. None of them rushed to the police station. Michael himself did exactly what he'd said he would. He headed back out into the night, over to the fairy fort, and waited. Michael stood by the fort with the large knife in his hand, watching the darkness, convinced that at any moment the fairies would undo the exchange and send his real wife back. But as he waited for hours in the cold, well beyond midnight, nothing came. By this point, Michael was too deep into his story though, and it didn't change his conviction. After all, he had to be right. Otherwise, he'd just murdered his wife in cold blood. By dawn, neighbours saw him there, pacing the outer ring, staring into the distance, gripping the large knife in his hand. When asked why he was there, he told them calmly that Bridget was with the fairies, and he was waiting for her to return. Nothing about his behaviour alarmed the neighbours at first. Strange stories were not unusual around a fairy fort, but then he returned the next night, and the night after that. For 3 nights he took vigil, alone on that hill, whispering prayers into the cold air, waiting for a horse that was never going to appear. The longer he stayed, the more unsettling he became. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes were hollow, and he kept repeating the same lines over and over. She'll come back, any day now. Even though nobody who'd been present during her murder dared speak about what had happened, all avoiding each other, convinced that their silence might somehow erase the horror of it all, Ballyvadlia was a small place. The very day after Bridget had been killed, rumours were already spreading that she was missing. People knew she'd been terribly ill, and many had heard the screaming from the cottage and seen the strange comings and goings. Some neighbours had even witnessed enough of what happened on the 13th and 14th to know that whatever was going on inside that house, it was more than just superstition. William Simpson was a neighbour who'd been present during the initial ritual. When he asked Michael about his wife, he was told she'd left the house at midnight on Friday, wearing only her nightdress. But next time they spoke, Michael asked him for a revolver. He told him he needed to rescue her from the fairies, and nobody else would help him. Simpson refused to give him the gun, frightened by the request. On Monday morning, Jack, the storyteller whose suggestions and claims had set the entire tragedy in motion, met Michael on a road. At first, he believed the lie Michael told him, that Bridget had wandered off in a fever and gotten lost. He offered to help him look for her. But as the pair combed the fields, the hedgerows, the slopes of Kylenagrana Hill, Michael grew increasingly agitated, and his story kept changing. Next, he told Jack that his wife had been having an affair with an eggman and that she'd probably run off with him. But eventually, he couldn't contain himself, and he blurted out what had really happened to his wife that Friday night. If Michael had expected Jack to praise him for what he'd done to the fairy impostor, he'd severely misjudged him. Instead, Jack froze in horror, demanding to know why he'd done it. For Michael, the answer was obvious. It wasn't his wife, just as Jack had told him. The real Bridget was being held captive still. He'd only burned the changeling. Trembling with disbelief, Jack told him he needed to give himself up immediately, saying he would have no living on earth if he didn't. As we've already seen, when Jack spoke, Michael listened, so he agreed to go to the church and confess what he'd done with him. When Father Ryan found him in his church, Michael was pale and shaking. He seemed manic and wild. And so when he asked for confession, Father Ryan initially refused, too frightened of what he would say as he mumbled about fairies and white horses. Michael told him anyway, justifying and explaining away every horrible detail of what he'd done. As soon as he left, Father Ryan went to the police. Father Ryan didn't tell the police everything. Instead, he just told them he had reason to believe Bridget had been a victim of foul play. When Acting Sergeant Egan approached Michael to ask him about his wife's whereabouts, Michael told him that Bridget had left the house at midnight, and that both Joanna Burke and her own father had seen her safe and well. For a man who supposedly wholeheartedly believed his fairy narrative, he seemed to put a lot of effort into covering his tracks and lying about what he'd done. Later that evening, Egan went to the Cleary cottage to check on the situation firsthand. But he found the house locked, with no signs of life. Convinced Michael was lying to him, he forced his way inside through a window anyway, and in the kitchen he found the burned remains of a woman's nightdress. The next morning, the police launched a full search. They scoured every farmhouse, every shed, every ditch, from Cloneen to Mullinahone. And as they questioned every neighbour, more and more of them began to speak. Those who'd heard things, those who'd been present during the initial ritual, such as William Simpson, and even those who'd actually witnessed the murder itself. Joanna Burke was the first to talk, and despite swearing to God to never speak of what she'd seen, she told them everything. It was enough for them to issue warrants for 11 people on March 20th, including Michael, Bridget's father Patrick Boland, her aunt Mary Kennedy, several of her Kennedy cousins, and the storyteller Jack Dunn. The fairy doctor Dennis Gainey was also arrested, though he was cleared and released not long after. The following day, they all stood before the magistrates in Clonmel, trying to maintain the story Michael had fed them. That Bridget had walked away into the night, alive and unharmed. The authorities knew it wasn't true, but without a body, they had no way to prove it. And despite all the things they'd heard, there wouldn't be a way to charge anyone for anything beyond disappearance or wounding, a Victorian legal charge for causing injury or participating in violent assaults, even if you didn't deal the fatal blow. So District Inspector Wansborough ordered one more search for Bridget, a deliberate, methodical sweep of every empty field and ditch around all of Ballyvadlia. On March 22nd, a police sergeant noticed something small, something that shouldn't have been there. Freshly cut thorn branches scattered in a ditch near the Kai Lenagrana Hill Ferry Fort, covering disturbed ground. So he brushed them aside and began to dig. Only a few inches down, the charred remains of a woman emerged from the soil. She was naked and curled into herself. Nothing was left of her but blackened bone and burned flesh. Her face was wrapped inside a sack. When he opened it up, he saw Bridget Cleary staring back at him, clear as day. Because for some reason, her face had remained intact. Somehow it had avoided the flames and been perfectly preserved by the cold. With that discovery, it was clear that every person, every family member, who had told the police they had seen her alive and well had been lying. The coroner's inquest was held the next day, with a dozen men gathered around what was left of Bridget's body. Her right side had been burned through so deeply that her internal organs were exposed. Her hands were charred and contracted. The muscles of her spine were scorched down to the bone. When confronted with the discovery of the body, everyone the police had in custody started to open up, revealing their roles in the horrific events. All of them claimed they had no idea it would go so far, and that they had no involvement in her death, singling Michael out as the one who had killed her. But Michael himself didn't confess. In fact, he didn't even cry or show any signs of remorse. Instead, he calmly told them that his wife had been taken by the fairies, and that the body in the ditch wasn't Bridget. He told them his real wife would be returned to him at the ring fort. What he had killed, he said, was nothing more than an old deceiver. To the police it was madness, but to the newspapers it was dynamite. By early April of 1895, 8 people were in court facing charges related to Bridget's death. Michael Cleary stood hollow-eyed in the dock. Patrick Boland, her father who had stood by and watched, looked like a man already half buried with his daughter. Mary Kennedy, her ageing aunt, gripped the rail for balance. Her 3 sons, Patrick, James, and William, were lined up beside her, big, silent farm boys who had helped hold her down. Michael Kennedy, another cousin, lingered at the edge of the group. And then there was Jack Dunn, the storyteller whose talk of fairies had seeped into every corner of the case. When the trials formally began in July 1895, the courthouse in Clonmel was packed. Reporters from Dublin and London squeezed in beside local farmers and townspeople. Crowds even formed outside, with people desperate to get in and see what was happening. All 8 of the defendants had been charged with wounding for their roles in the assaults and torture, and 5 of them stood accused of the actual murder: Michael, Patrick Boland, Mary Kennedy, and her sons James and Patrick. Witness after witness took the stand. William Simpson and his wife described everything they saw on March 14th, including how Bridget was forced to drink the concoction, had urine thrown at her, and how Michael had burnt her face with a hot poker. Despite being present during the entire ordeal from start to finish, Joanna Burke had avoided charges by becoming the prosecution's key witness. On the stand, she revealed that during the torture, Bridget had whispered to her that Michael had been making a fairy out of her for months, and that he'd threatened to burn her long before that night. This is an intriguing detail, as it potentially reveals that Michael had either always intended to use the fairy excuse to harm his wife, or at the very least, the twisted beliefs he held about her existed long before Jack began spinning his story. The prosecutor argued that Michael had used folklore as a weapon, that his wife's independence, her modernity, her defiance had unsettled him, and that the fairy story had basically given him permission to act violently. The defense didn't try to argue a different version of events had happened. Instead, they focused their attention on the motivation. According to them, this wasn't murder. It was belief. They said the people in that cottage genuinely thought Bridget had been taken by the fairies and replaced with a changeling, that the rituals they used were part of an older folk tradition that had existed for generations, that they had been, in their own twisted way, trying to help Bridget. They were trying to save her, not kill her. They argued that because the cottage door hadn't been kept shut, because neighbours had been allowed in and out, and because as many as 10 people saw the final burning, there could not have been any secret, deliberate plan to kill her. The final word on the matter belonged to Justice O'Brien. He told the jury that this extraordinary case revealed a degree of darkness in the mind, but he also agreed with the defence and ruled out the possibility of a murder conviction. In Irish law, murder required clear intent to kill. In his view, what had happened in that cottage was something murkier, a lethal mix of fear, superstition, and brutal ignorance. On July 5th, the verdicts were delivered. Michael Cleary was found guilty, but not of murder, of manslaughter. As a result, he was sentenced to 20 years behind bars. The others all received shorter sentences for wounding. Patrick Boland was given 6 months of hard labour. Various Kennedy cousins received terms ranging from 6 months to 5 years. Jack Dunn was sentenced to 3 years. Mary Kennedy was released on account of her age and frailty. Outside, the crowd roared its approval. Inside, the man at the centre of it all wept and shouted that he was innocent. Even as he was found guilty, he still insisted that he hadn't killed his wife. He'd just driven out the fairy. By the time the trial ended, the story of Bridget Cleary had escaped the boundaries of Tipperary and even of Ireland itself. The case had become a sensation. Across Britain, newspapers treated the killing as confirmation of old prejudices. Papers in London, Glasgow, and Manchester described rural Ireland as backward and superstitious, as if the actions of one household spoke for an entire country. Across the Atlantic, American papers ran with the same angle, publishing lurid accounts of a supposed witch burning in 1895. They leaned into the spectacle, treating the case less like the death of a real woman and more like a dark curiosity from an unenlightened countryside. Everywhere the story travelled, it was presented as a moral lesson about Ireland, rather than the tragedy of a single woman. And all of this happened against the background of a much larger argument. For decades, Irish politicians had been fighting for the right to govern their own country. British opponents of Irish self-government seized on the case as ammunition. They argued that if rural Catholics still believed in fairy forts and changelings, how could they be trusted to run a modern state? After the sentencing, the prisoners were taken away. and the public spectacle eventually moved on. Bridget Cleary was buried in Cloneen Cemetery under the cover of darkness. Her funeral was handled quietly by the Royal Irish Constabulary, given that most of her family were now behind bars. Michael Cleary began his sentence in Maryborough Prison. He served 15 of his 20 years before being released on April 28, 1910. He didn't return to Ballivadlia. Instead, he travelled to Liverpool, and within months, he had immigrated to Canada. A letter from the Home Office later confirmed that he had sailed for Montreal at the end of June that year. After that, he disappeared from the record. He never apologised for what he'd done. He never revealed if he truly believed the fairy story he had repeated so many times. He just vanished, and continued living his life in a way his wife never had the chance to. The others served their shorter sentences and drifted back into ordinary life, carrying the weight of what had happened in that cottage for the rest of their days. Jack Dunn, the storyteller who first suggested the changeling idea, found work as a labourer after his release. He lived quietly and kept well away from anything to do with fairies. Over time, the story of Bridget Cleary was twisted into something else: a legend, a cautionary tale, and a slogan. She began to be called the last witch burned in Ireland, even though she'd never been charged with witchcraft and no one had accused her of being a witch. It's sort of weird that she's been given the witch label, because in the minds of the people who tortured and killed her, she wasn't a witch at all. She was a changeling, a stand-in left by the good people, while the real Bridget was being held captive in some unseen fort under the hill. Calling what happened to Bridget a witch burning misses the point entirely. She was a modern, independent woman. She was literate, stylish, and earning her own income, in a place where that alone could spark resentment and make her a target. And it's in that tension that the real story of what happened lies: a mix of old folklore, rigid gender expectations, and one man's fear and fragile ego that created the circumstances for a murder to be justified as a cure. Her death is a prime example of how belief can be twisted to justify control, coercion, and violence, especially against women. Today, children in Ireland still sing the rhyme, "Are you a witch, or are you a fairy? Or are you the wife of Michael Cleary?" But somewhere between all the nursery rhymes, the sensational headlines, and the political speeches, the simplest of truth seems to have been forgotten. Bridget was not a witch. She was not a fairy. She was a 26-year-old woman. She was clever, kind, and independent. And she died because other people chose a story over her life. More than a century later, her case survives because it reveals something uncomfortable: that the most frightening monsters are never as dangerous as the people who believe in them. And with that, our deep dive into the case of Bridget Cleary comes to a close. I feel like this case sits in that really intriguing place in time and history alongside the Rugen Ripper video I recently did. That strange, murky time period where old world beliefs are smashing against the rocks of the new world. So hopefully you found it as interesting as I did. As always, thanks so much for watching. If you did find this video interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe and do all that other stuff to appease our own folklore monsters here on YouTube, the hungry and unpredictable algorithm gods. If you want to support my channel further, there's a membership option here on YouTube and a Patreon linked down below as well. So until next time, you have been watching The Mystery Abyss.